Welcome, everyone. Today, we are talking about walking kids through grief. So, this is something that is so hard and timely because of what's happened recently in Texas. And it's top of mind where we're thinking about how do we have these conversations? How do we help kids, teenagers, young adults navigate this hard side of life that we can't protect them from, even though we desperately want to. We want to take away the struggle and take away the sadness, and yet we can't. And that is life. And we know by midlife, we know that to be a truth. And so we brought on the expert today. Clarissa Moll is an award-winning writer and podcaster who helps bereaved people find flourishing after loss. And so what a perfect person to have on to talk about this. Her writing appears in places like Christianity Today, the Gospel Coalition, Relevant, Modern Loss, Grief Digest, and so many more. She co-hosted Christianity Today's Surprised by Grief podcast and produces Christianity Today's flagship news podcast, The Bulletin. And her debut book, Beyond the Darkness, A Gentle Guide for Living with Grief and Thriving After Loss, was a bestseller new release in 2022. So very recently. And she has had a few other books, and most recently, which I've got in front of me right now, she has a children's book, which is Hope Comes to Stay. And this is a children's book that helps parents to talk through grief and to really help kids understand what they're going through. So we're going to be entering all of this territory today. She is a remarried widow and lives with her blended family in the Boston area. So Clarissa, welcome. We're so glad to have you today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So obviously, your children's book comes out of your own story of struggle and loss. So can you just start there? What happened in your life?
Sure. Well, it's a story I never thought I would tell, a parenting journey I never thought I would be on. But in 2019, in the middle of our family's summer vacation, my husband fell to his death in a hiking accident in the backcountry of Mount Rainier National Park. Rob was a conscientious hiker. He didn't take risks. He was an avid hiker, a climber. He knew what he was doing, and it was an accident. And two police chaplains arrived at my campsite that night, 3,000 miles from home, to deliver the news that he wasn't coming back, that the good night and goodbye that he had said to our kids the night before in our camper was the final goodbye. It was the last one, the last I love you, the last kiss on the forehead before bed. And they were waking up to a new reality, as was I, the reality that I would now be a widow with 4 kids to raise alone. My youngest had just turned 7. My oldest was 13. And so this has been the life we have navigated over the last 6 years, figuring out how to not just hang on and survive until Jesus comes again, but to live fully and to really enjoy the life that God has put before us. Because even though Rob died that day, July 19th, 2019, we didn't. We're still here. And I have to believe that God has good purposes in mind for each of us.
Your kids were at really interesting ages because they were all old enough to understand. Sometimes when this happens, when a parent dies, a child is so young, they won't remember that moment. But your kids were all old enough that they will remember that moment for the rest of their lives. And they were at very different developmental stages too. So you were having to navigate that while navigating your own grief, obviously. So what was your next step in that story? You got that news, and then what happened?
Well, I really appreciate what the chaplain said next, because I feel like in many ways it became the divine hand of God nudging us in a direction toward hope and resilience. I said to the chaplains, "Do I have to tell my kids the news?" And they said, "Nope, that's our job. All you're here to be is a shoulder to cry on." And what a relief in that moment to realize that my job wasn't to valiantly lead the way through the valley of the shadow, a space I had never entered before, but I was simply to be a companion to my children in the journey. And for me, over the last 6 years, as I have worked to raise them, we've gone through almost every developmental stage. I've launched kids to college. I've gone to proms and graduations and those dreadful daddy-daughter dances for the girl who has no daddy to dance with. We have
Mm.
faced all of those things together, but we have faced them as companions. And I think when we're talking about children and grief, their grief is so different. Their understanding is so different from adults when it comes to suffering and loss, that the best posture we can ever take is simply to sit at their feet, to let them be the teachers, and to promise our companionship for the long haul.
Yeah, that consistency.
Mhm.
It matters, that presence, that the power, the ministry of presence. So, I mean, I would just love to hear, there's things in our life that happen that we know is coming because maybe someone gets a diagnosis or it's not planned necessarily, but we can warm up to it a little bit. Whereas in your case, it was sudden. And I think a lot of people have things like that where something happens and it's a suddenly this. And so you are walking deeply through your own process and you feel like you have to be there for these children that you are stewarding alone. And so can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because even if people haven't had your exact situation, I think they can relate to that.
Yeah. Well, you hit middle life and it still does feel like a lot of things come up suddenly. We're old enough to realize that life is hard, that bad things happen to good people. We don't have the illusion of
Mm,
invincibility that we
mhm,
had when we were in our 20s, but we're
mhm.
not old enough to feel like our bodies are failing. We don't have a lot of friends who are going through significant losses, and that's loss of any kind. When we're in our middle age, we are at the height of our careers, we're the height of a depth of our family relationships, of friendships. We're really running the course with joy. And so to be blindsided by the loss of a job, an estrangement in a family relationship, a marriage that hits the rocks and goes south, it does feel like it's coming out of nowhere. And to be able to guide our kids through that while we're trying to figure it out ourselves, it just feels so topsy turvy. And, I think about it a lot as a corollary to the conversations that we have with our kids. And if you're in middle life and you're a mom or a dad right now, you're struggling with having those conversations about sexuality with your kids, the birds and the bees conversations,
Mhm.
right? And boy, do those feel like they've come out of nowhere. All of a sudden, I've got a 12-year-old who comes home from school and is asking questions I didn't think she was even thinking of. What do I say? What do I do? And we realize that we're so ill prepared for the big things that life will inevitably bring. And so when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about what can I do to be more ready? And really, I don't want to have to learn on the fly. I would surely like to have a little bit of an on ramp. And the reality is that the on ramp can begin today. It is never too late to begin having those elemental conversations about what happens when suffering crosses our paths. We
Mm.
teach our kids the ABCs years before they will ever write their college entrance essay. We do that on purpose, right? Because it takes a long time to be ready to articulate those realities in a way that makes sense to anyone else. And we can do exactly the same thing, no matter how old our kids are, to begin those conversations about death and dying, loss, suffering, and grief. We can have those conversations around the dinner table when we're talking about the autumn leaves that are falling and how dead everything just feels during the winter. Why do we feel the winter blues, even though we know the resurrection hope of spring is coming? Have those elemental conversations around the dinner table. On the way home from school, we can talk about disappointments and how they kind of come out of nowhere. Could we have seen it coming? How could we prepare? Wondering together, because teenagers really like wondering together. They don't want a prescription. They would
Mm.
much rather sit with us in that mystery and in that space and wrestle with us. And when the hard things come, we can be blunt and honest. straightforward. We can use real words, death, died, dying, instead of words like passed away. For people of faith, it's always complicated because we want to talk in real language about these things in the same way that we have birds and the bees conversations, while also articulating the nuances and the abstractions of faith. And so we're learning to do that hand in hand, developing that vocabulary that equips our kids to talk about suffering, and developing a vocabulary, a language, a fluency of consolation. Because the reality is, not only is stuff going to happen to them, stuff's going to happen to the people that they love. And we want them to be prepared. And it's okay to start where we are.
I'm thinking about this counselor I talked to one time, and he said, when painful things happen to kids in their childhood, it actually is a gift for adulthood. So if someone just has really an idyllic childhood, nothing happens, they're actually less equipped as adults to face the painful things that inevitably come. And so he called it the gift of pain in childhood. And I thought that was so fascinating. And I really leaned in and was listening because, that really is our hope, is that we would spare our children pain, whatever age that they are, whether they're young, teenagers, young adults. It's so hard as parents to watch them in pain, and yet to flip that script and to say, actually, no, that is the gift that we're giving them or that they're experiencing that is going to prepare them for adulthood. It's a real shift in a mindset. And so I really like what you're saying there about just the practical, no, use real words, talk to them about real things. So how have you had those conversations all along the journey, and what has that looked like for you?
Well, I really resonate with that comment that you heard because, boy, after my kids lost their dad, I did not want them to ever experience anything hard again. And I wanted to bubble wrap them and protect them, run interference for them at every cost. And it really took a lot for me to kind of sit on my hands and say, all right, I'm not going to do that. When they get a bad grade in school, I'm going to let it sting for a little bit. I'm going to let them talk with the teacher about it. When they have a friend problem, I'm not going to offer a solution. I'm going to sit and listen and watch them reason through it and offer my supportive presence and let it hurt for a bit. And that's really hard because what we want to do is develop resilience without toughness. Suffering for a child can do one of two things. It can calcify them, it can harden them, or it can break them open. And what we want for our children is not that they get tougher. We do not want them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We do not want them to lean into this sort of American illusion of self-reliance that we know is so divorced from the life of faith. Instead, we want their hearts to be broken open by the things that they experience, that they're able to be vulnerable with people in their lives, that they're able to love others vulnerably. And so what that's looked like for our family is a lot of conversations about toughness. What does it mean to really be tough? And is toughness actually what we want? Nobody wants to eat tough meat. And the reality is nobody wants a tough friend either. They want a sensitive friend. They want a wise friend. And how is our grief allowing us to develop those kind of character qualities that are really the kinds of the fruits of the Spirit? And so a lot of times when it would be a particular instance, it would be like, okay, are you trying to shoulder through here? Or are you going to let yourself be vulnerable? Are you going to let yourself be loved? Are you going to let yourself be weak in this space? What is there to learn from the difficult emotions that we have to hold in tension? Something that we struggle with as adults. And I appreciate the opportunities to be honest with my kids and say, hey, listen, I'm not good at it either. How about we keep each other accountable? And I'm going to not pretend to be tough. You're going to call me on it because kids love to call their parents on stuff. And I'm going to call you on it too when I see you trying to be tough. Because toughness isn't what we want. We want resilience and we want a spirit of resurrection for our kids.
That's an interesting distinction between toughness and resilience, because I do think we want to raise resilient kids. And I've been learning a lot about childhood trauma and brain development, and the question of when an event happens, say to siblings that are in the same family, for one child, they can incorporate it as a traumatic event. And to another, it can be something that they see as hard, but as a bump in the road that maybe builds character. And the question behind that is, why do kids respond differently? And what I've heard is that it does depend some on their past trauma and the pathways that have been created in their brains. So each child's response is not just based on the moment and the circumstances of the moment, but it's based on everything that they've experienced in life and their understanding of the world developmentally and what developmental stage they're in. And so to remember that as we're talking about this, that every child is going to respond differently, and it's going to shape and impact each child differently. So can you talk a little bit, I don't know how open you are about your own kids' experiences, but just what you've learned about how maybe two children who experience the same type of event may respond differently, or it may have long-term impacts in a different way.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up that point because grief is universal. But it's also unique. We respond to it with our own wiring, the wiring that God has blessed us with, and the wiring that has developed because of the brokenness of the world. We also respond with our capacity to understand developmentally. So, a little child, I think about my youngest who had just turned 7. She has very few memories of that traumatic night. It is seared in my memory. And I need to be careful that I do not perceive that as insensitive or a desire to sort of brush things away or avoidant. That's just the reality of what life is like when you've just turned 7. You have certain things that are seared into your memory, certain things that kind of pass you by. And many times, kids who are that young are concrete thinkers. They don't ruminate on a lot of stuff. And so the idea that daddy was here one day and he wasn't the next seemed totally normal to a 7-year-old. Now we know that children re-grieve over time. And so it's important to not see a child's response to suffering or loss as a definitive response. We know that children interact with their loss as their understanding grows over time. So what she felt in that moment will be different than what she feels the night she's getting ready to graduate from high school. That loss is going to feel different to her. It may feel very raw in a way that she's never experienced that rawness before. And that's okay, because that's a signal of her growing understanding, of her wrestling with her loss. And so it's important to be aware of that not only is each child going to respond differently because they're wired differently, but they're going to respond differently because they're changing people. And that's where being a student of that child is super important. Asking those wondering questions, receiving their answers with honesty. A lot of times I'll have parents say, my kid isn't crying at all. Is something wrong with him? Maybe so, maybe not. Maybe that's how he processes his loss. He gets out on the soccer field and he kicks that ball around. By the time he gets home, he doesn't need to cry. That's just a normal part of the way God has wired him to process emotion, and he's doing just fine. Or it could mean that he's really struggling to be able to articulate how he feels. And so being a student of that child allows me to get to know better some of those rhythms as those children are developing and changing over time.
Yeah, you bring up something that I really want to hit on, and that is, what if your children will not talk to you about their grief? I have 4 kids, and I would say there's only one that would probably be able to articulate a profound loss. Like if I look back at their younger years, there's probably only one that would have been able to do that. And so what do you do if you're trying and you're trying to help kids have that language, speak it out loud, and they won't?
Well, I appreciate that y'all have brought up the idea of adverse childhood experiences because ACEs are the foundation of research and psychology. they're just experiences that are hard for kids. It could be something as severe as abuse. It could be something that we might perceive as adults to be as simple as a move or a job change, a school change. Any of these things can create little t trauma or big T trauma in our children's lives. And what research tells us about these adverse childhood experiences is that all it takes is one trusted adult to make the difference. It doesn't take one mom or one dad. It takes one trusted adult. And boy, for me as a mom, what a sigh of relief. It's not all up to me. If my kid doesn't talk to me, okay, it's a big deal. As long as that child has one trusted adult in his or her life who can be ready and willing to say, I love you. I'm sorry for the way that the brokenness of the world has infected your life, and I am here for the long haul for you. That might be a coach. It might be a teacher. It might be a youth leader, a neighbor. And so part of my job as a parent is not to be the one single source of consolation for my child. It's to make sure I am positioning my child in such a way to develop those kind of relationships. Because the reality is when they get to adulthood, that's what they're going to need. As a married woman, I can say, gosh, I love my husband, but he can't be everything. I need my girlfriends, because there are some things that women just get about each other. And I want to teach my kids that when they get older, I don't want them to depend on one person to be their whole world and their whole community. It takes a village to walk us all home to Jesus. And I hope they find that in their faith community. But I also hope they find that in the myriad other deep and meaningful relationships that will support them through the hard things that they have to face.
That's really good. Really good. And you mentioned the adverse childhood experiences, and now research is coming out about the BCEs, or beneficial childhood experiences, that are the counteraction to that, and that every connection that a child has helps with that rewiring of the brain.
That's right.
So every connection at Sunday school, every connection with the extended family system, and the stronger the support network, then the more likely the child in the long term will be able to recover and have that kind of resilience that I think was what the counselor was referencing with Krista about. Then you've had this guided experience of health towards healing that can then make you be the kind of person that knows, I can withstand hard things, and in fact, I can overcome them. Talk to us about conversations around faith, because when bad things happen, especially out of order in the way that we think they should in our minds, we can have really big questions for God. And I mean, I think Krista referenced what's happening in Texas this week. We're hearing all kinds of questions about how would God allow this kind of tragedy to happen to innocent children, to families that were simply enjoying their 4th of July. I mean, I can't even talk about it. It's just, it so goes against our reasoning of how the world should be. So we're having those questions, perhaps as adults. How do we talk to kids about those questions? And my guess is maybe there's different ways with different ages.
Yeah, you're so right. It's different ways with different ages. When I think about teenagers in particular, I think about the conversations that my daughter Fiona and I had together as we were writing our book for teens, Hurt, Help, Hope. Because a lot of teen literature we had found about grief support was just very elemental. It was a lot about school and relationships and, things like why you don't want to eat anymore, or why you wish you had a boyfriend after something bad happened. And they rarely touched on faith. And the reality is that for kids who are entering that developmental stage, those big why questions are probably the biggest questions that they have. They can figure out all the eating stuff and the sleeping hacks on TikTok, but they can't get an easy answer to why God would take away someone that they love, or why God would allow a certain thing to happen, however they want to phrase it. They need someone to sit in the questions and wrestle with them. And when it comes to those kind of questions about faith, We've got to be super careful. I think of Job's friends in the book of Job who were so great at showing up, but they said all the wrong things. It would have been so much better if they had just sat in the ashes with him and stopped giving their opinions about what God was doing. And what I find with teenagers is that they are so ready to ditch the pat answers. They know the sort of hallmark Bible verse stuff doesn't work. They've watched it play out in their own lives. What they really need is someone who is a faithful lover of Jesus, who says, okay, these are the things I know. He never leaves you or forsakes you. He is always present to you. He loves you. And he too weeps about the brokenness of the world. I'm going to repeat those over you. I'm going to recite those to your heart over and over again, because there is so much that we don't know. And we're going to sit in the mystery together, and we're going to repeat to our hearts the things that are true. And I always appreciated, after my husband died, going to church. It was the hardest place that our family went after our loss.
Mm.
We didn't fit in anymore. We were a mom with 4 kids, and suddenly there was a spot next to me that was empty and couldn't be filled. There was rejoicing, and we didn't feel like rejoicing. Everything felt out of whack. But the thing that was such a comfort to me was when our church would pray, and I would inevitably cry through all of the praying, so much that I couldn't speak. And never before and never since have I felt so carried to Jesus by the words of other people. I think of the story where a bunch of friends brought their friend to Jesus and they let him down through the roof. And really, when it comes to those questions of faith that have no easy answers, we rely on the things that we know to be true about God's character, and we rely on his people to literally open the roof and let us down to the feet of Jesus. And I'm reminded, C.S. Lewis writes in his book, Till We Have Faces, about this woman who struggles with these kinds of questions about faith and God. And she rails against God, much like Job does in the book of Job. And there's this moment Lewis describes where she's kind of run out of her angry words, and she's left with silence. And she says, in that silence, I realized that, God, you are the answer, that before you all questions fall away. And I think that that's something you only learn when you're willing to sit in the mystery, to sit in the tension of the now and the not yet. And you can't do it alone. Jesus promises to be there with you, but you really need another person of faith to sit beside you and say, I don't get it either. This is terrible. Let's recite to our hearts what we know to be true about God, and we're going to wait on him in this valley of the shadow together. I'm not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm. That just is solid. That's just solid right there. So I'm also wondering, as you were talking, sometimes grief needs a place to go. Grief needs a place to be expressed. And so, were there any rituals or even physical things that you would do to help give that an outlet?
Mm-hmm. So the Dougie Center for Families with Grieving Children, fantastic resource that exists. They publish a series of books that allow little children to do just that, to kind of make material their loss. And I bought one of those to work through with my daughter, included drawing pictures, remembering things. I would write the words because her handwriting was cut. She would always complain that her hand was tired. And so I would do the writing and she would do the drawing. And she drew some pretty serious pictures, daddy lying on the table at the funeral home. And we wrote some really heart-wrenching stuff in that book. But it was a way for her to process what she understood about loss in an age-appropriate way. We did all kinds of other things as a family. We would remember him around the table, sharing stories, laughing about him, because we didn't want to turn him into an idol or a myth. We wanted to remember he was a real guy who hated tomatoes and would sometimes laugh so loud that it felt like it made the windows shake. We wanted to keep him real in our memories. And we also looked for ways that we could let our grief have a place to go in community, because grief is so isolating. You can feel like the only kid in your class who doesn't have a dad or a mom, or who lost a grandmother, or who lost a friend. You can feel like nobody would understand. And so forcing ourselves out of that little cocoon of grief to say, hey, can we remember him with you? Can we take a hike on one of his favorite trails just to remember him together? And we're going to laugh and we're going to talk. And maybe we don't even talk about him, but we all know why we're there. Can we remember him around the dinner table? Could we run a 5K in his memory? Could we build something together and afterwards say, boy, he'd be so proud of us? Look at the shed we put together all by ourselves. Remembering him in community was a really important way of not feeling like we were the sole bearers of the legacy, of the memory, and of the suffering.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. It's so good. So good. And they matter. Those things matter deeply. It really does. It helps. It helps me. And I know that it helps children when they have an outlet for that. Are there any other resources that you would mention or just a guide or a coach or a comfort to you in that time?
Well, I think in addition to the Dougie Center, which has tons of resources, I mean, if you're a teacher and you're looking for ways to talk about what has happened in a school shooting in your community, they've got downloadable resources to talk through those things with kids. We've used them in our school community after community losses. A student passed away, and there were downloadables that they provided to teachers to be able to say, hey, if this comes up in class or on the soccer field, here's how to talk about it, how to start the conversation. So those resources are beyond just families, but they're for educators, caregivers. But another one that I found that was kind of a curious thing for me as a mom was an organization called Refuge Widowers. And it was particularly interesting for me because there are so few resources for men. And I say this, as a woman to two women, because I guarantee you in our three circles of influence, there are some dudes we know who are doing the hard things by themselves. They're
Mm-hmm.
struggling through job loss by themselves and they feel like they've got to shoulder it. They're single parenting by themselves. They're wrestling with caring for a chronically aging parent and they feel like they're alone. And for men, it seems like there's a particular barrier to the kind of conversations that we women, we kibbutz about these things, but men just don't do that. And so for me as a woman raising two sons, I really wanted to know, how do men do this well? Because I didn't have a husband anymore to lead my boys through this. And so Refuge of Widowers is a wonderful organization to tap in to say, okay, how do I teach my sons to become men who can shoulder sorrow in ways that don't toughen them up, that make them tender men, and also glorify God? And I found that organization to be a real help as a mom of sons.
Thank you for those. That's so good. That's all so helpful. Well, as we close today, what would be your final words to parents, whether it's a significant loss or it's, like you said, a smaller T trauma? What would be your final encouragement?
I think my encouragement would be it's not too late. If the loss happened 10 years ago, it's not too late to start talking about it now. If you feel like you pushed things away and you kind of wanted to avoid the conversation, it's not too late to start now. There's never a moment that is too late to begin. And I think, when you realize that grief is a lifelong companion, that this isn't a 5-step process, you're going to get a certificate and a medal at the end. You're going to walk with grief until Jesus comes again. You realize, okay, I've got time. I've got the rest of my life to figure out how to do this well, how to steward this pain in a way that brings me toward resilience and resurrection. It is not too late. And so start today. Start in the very smallest way that is possible, moment to moment, hour to hour, if that's necessary. But take those small steps because you have time. It's okay.
Yeah, that is so hope-filled. Thank you so much, Clarissa. It's just been
Yes.
really, really wonderful to have you on today.
Thanks for having me.